So welcome everyone. Welcome to London Business School Wheeler Institute for Business and Development COVID-19 series. Today we are very pleased and honored to have with us Oriana Bandiera to discuss about some very exciting research that she has been underdoing with colleagues about the impact of COVID-19 in Bangladesh, something that carries important lessons for many other frontier and low-income countries. Oriana doesn't need much of an introduction, but let me just stress that she's one of the most important economists of the past decades. She serves with considerable service in the profession. Currently, she serves as the editor of Econometrica, one of the top 5 leading academic journals in economics, and also as the vice president of the European Economic Association. Her work, and Oriana has done a very different type of work on organization, on firms, in development economics, even in political economy. She has a very cool paper on nation building. Oriana has, in the past couple of years, conducted very interesting research, among others on Ebola. We'll ask her in the end about what can we learn about the impact of the Ebola nowadays with COVID-19. And her work has been recognized with a plethora of awards. The ISA Best Labor Economist, the Young Labor Economist is actually quite important that, and also recently from the European Economic Association, from the Johansson Prize, awarded every 2 years to the very best European economist under the age of 45. Oriana, and the standard is very busy, homeschooling, editing a journal, presiding the European Economic Association, doing research, talking with people on the field. So thanks a lot for taking the time. And, let me just ask you, for us and for the Wheeler Institute, Bangladesh is a very interesting case. We see many countries seeking support from the IMF and the Rich Club of Nations. What does your research shows about the implications of COVID in Bangladesh? And then I will ask you, what are the lessons perhaps for other countries?
Certainly. Thank you for having me on this series, Elias. So unfortunately, this is not good news. So what the data from Bangladesh show is that all the progress that we've been making in poverty reduction, which is like the great good news of the last 20 years, the share of people living in extreme poverty has been dropping year after year. Unfortunately, this progress has been shown to be quite fragile. So I'm going to cite now some recent survey data that BRAC, our partner in Bangladesh, collected from a representative sample of 5,500 households, both in urban slums and rural areas. This is a phone survey which they ran immediately after the start of lockdown in Bangladesh to see how the lockdown impacted the economic lives of these households. And I'll just show you some numbers in slides just to give you an idea, because, picture is worth 1,000 words. So this is the rate of job loss. The first numbers that you see is the percentage of main earners, which have basically got zero income in the past week. And we have 2 samples here. You see, you have the slums and the rural areas, and then also respondent divided by the level of poverty. And you see that across the board, there's been a huge amount of job loss. More than half respondents, sometimes all the way up to 2/3, had no income in the previous week. Now, the consequence of this is that most of them have fallen into poverty, even those who were not poor to start with. Because, see, this sample contains those who are called vulnerable non-poor. These are people who are above the poverty line, but because they lost their job and they didn't work for weeks, they're now well below. Now, this is quite problematic because if people who are well above the poverty line fall below, then most of the progress that we've been making in the fight against poverty will be lost. Some colleagues at the IGC have estimated the impact of lockdowns in Africa using these numbers. So under the assumption that what we see in Bangladesh in terms of job loss is similar to what will happen in sub-Saharan Africa, how many people will fall into poverty? And the numbers there are even scarier, because what you see is that there's like millions of people falling into poverty, up to the point of bringing us back to the early 2000s. So all the progress that's been made since the early 2000s would be lost. We go back 20 years in terms of the number of people living in extreme poverty. They also estimate that the lack of food created by the lockdowns will basically generate a famine of such proportions that the total amount of people who will die will actually be as large as the number of people killed by famines in the last 40 years. So COVID is really bad news, but from the look of it, in the poorest countries in the world, it's not what's going to kill most people. It looks like we're going back to the world where people were dying of hunger.
And I guess people in Bangladesh, given your work, it's not that they can receive significant support from the government because Bangladesh is a frontier, low-income country with limited financial resources. As the macroeconomists would call it, there's not much fiscal space. Bangladesh is one of those 100 countries that have sought some form of support from the International Monetary Fund. So what can what can we do about this issue? Or perhaps you can dig into more data to those you have.
So your intuition is absolutely correct, because if we look at, in a recent piece of work, I've been analyzing data on the coverage of social protection programs in countries around the world, different countries around the world. And the picture that emerges is not particularly rosy. So what I'm going to show you now is basically from a recent piece of work that I did, where we look at the Aspire dataset at the World Bank. This is a dataset that contains the coverage of all social protection programs in 123 countries. And the data comes from expenditure and income surveys. So these are representative at the national level. So what this graph does is splits countries by level of income, and it tells you how many people in each country have social protection. If you look at the low-income countries, where most of sub-Saharan Africa is, there's only 20%, well, 18% of people who have access to social protection, because the big blue thing here is people who have no transfers. Now, even more worryingly, the people who do get the transfers are not the poorest. So this is sub-Saharan Africa, and it tells you for each quintile of income, the share of people who get transfers. And you see that it is pretty evenly distributed. So the bottom get 24%, the second get 14%, and so on. So there's actually no difference in the benefit incidence between the richest people and the poorest.
And Oriana, if I was to stop you there, bless you. This reflects, I guess, also the inability, the weak state capacity, perhaps, or other government failures, that they are not able in low-income countries to target those mostly in need. Is my intuition right?
Yes, absolutely. So we correlate this capacity of targeting to statistical capacity in the country, and there's a strong negative correlation, of course. Countries with good statistical capacity are capable of targeting. We correlate it with GDP, and GDP explains pretty much everything. It's a sufficient statistics for that.
So what do you think will be the way forward? One could say that the rich club of nations, advanced or industrial economies, although I hate those words, are now a bit inward-looking. They have to deal with rising inequality, rising unemployment in Germany, in the US. We just got the numbers from the US, sizable spike in unemployment. So how do you think first this crisis unfolding in low income and the lower middle income countries? And second, what can the international community perhaps do?
So unfortunately, this is a crisis like no other, because we've seen in the past when we had crises like pandemics like Ebola, that was mostly affecting sub-Saharan Africa, and the international community could help. But this is a pandemic that's affecting everybody. So it's very hard to rely on external sources of funding. I think what's most important is to stress the point that one policy doesn't fit all. And for instance, having lockdowns like we've had in the West, in sub-Saharan Africa might not be the best idea, because hunger will kill people before COVID does.
I see.
So for instance, that's one consideration.
Now, given that the data that you're collecting from Bangladesh, can we say something more about how households are responding to the epidemic and the lockdown?
So
I
households
don't know whether you ask any questions that I know development economics is now very keen on exploring about aspirations of the future.
Households are mostly running down their savings. But unfortunately, given that these are poor households, their savings won't last very long. So when actually they ask in the survey, how long will you be able to eat using your savings? And the answers vary between a week and 2 weeks. So in 2 weeks, you'll have a large segment of the population without any resources. So this is a call for redistribution. If there is any time in which redistribution is essential, this is now. And in particular, universal redistribution, because as I discussed earlier, these countries are not capable of targeting the poorest. And also the identity of poor people changes every day with this crisis. So I think universal transfers and food distribution are of great importance now.
I see. And going back to your findings, you find equally large effects to rural households and also to urban households, I guess mostly in slums and townships.
Yes. I think urban households are more at risk because that's where the lockdown has bigger impact on economic activity. So I think there's probably more focus to be put on urban households. In the data, we can't quite detect a big difference. Like everybody's is in a pretty poor situation, I would say. I would say we shouldn't worry too much about inclusion errors, which is what we normally worry about, giving transfers to people who do not deserve them or do not need them. Because in these cases, exclusion errors can really kill. So we have to worry about that a lot more.
I see. So since we have you here, let me also ask perhaps the last question. I know that you have been working on the Ebola, and you have a very interesting paper with Imran Rasul and various co-authors on the impact of the Ebola in Sierra Leone, if I'm not mistaken. And you look at the empowerment of women. And we read nowadays that perhaps there are asymmetric effects across gender of the current pandemic. Actually, we will host in the series Matthias Debke, who has been doing some interesting work on gender in advanced countries. So I just wanted you to briefly tell us about what your findings are about the Ebola. And the subsequent question is, can we extrapolate them, or can they be of use somehow, always with the caveats of today?
Of course. So we were in Sierra Leone because we were evaluating a program again by BRAC, which opened clubs for adolescent girls where girls could hang out together, but also learn skills for basic income generating activities. And as we were designing the baseline survey, we ran a baseline survey, and as the clubs were about to open, Ebola struck. So what that means is that we can measure the effect of the clubs and the effect of Ebola and the interaction between the two. So Ebola the response to Ebola, as the response to COVID nowadays, was largely social isolation. So all schools were closed in the entire country. And the first outcome for girls when schools close is that they become a lot more at risk of pregnancy, because instead of going to school, they hang out with men, many of whom have no jobs. And so the pregnancy rate increased dramatically. And these are young girls. So we're talking of a sample of girls between the ages of 13 and 17. So many of them got pregnant. And then when the schools reopened, unfortunately, the government implemented a policy by which it was forbidden for pregnant girls to go back to school. So a short-term shock, such as Ebola, ended up having very long-term consequences for a whole generation of girls, basically taking them out of school for good. And the clubs helped. So the villages where Ebola was most disruptive, had they had a club before, girls were much less likely to get pregnant.
This is, sorry to ask, so this is after social distancing was removed or before?
So after, because the clubs couldn't run, of course, while there was social distancing, the same way the schools couldn't run. But they did run for a bit. And what we think happened is that the girls learned techniques to avoid and to negotiate with men, so not to get pregnant, or maybe just the idea of having the club there once, you know, the lockdown ended was strong enough for them not to get into trouble. But we see that the effect of Ebola is much lower in villages in which BRAC opened the club, even though the club was not being used during the epidemic, of course.
So do you think that we should do, that perhaps, who knows, something similar is happening as we speak? Because now also, I presume, I haven't followed closely Sierra Leone, but you know, I presume there is going to be some social distancing and perhaps the schools are again closed.
Yes, I think that's quite problematic, I think, for young girls, because it's important to give them protection and ways to negotiate their way out of these situations, because the consequences can be really long lasting.
And again, if I was to a bit connect, you know, what you told us earlier about Bangladesh and low-income countries and your work on Ebola and underage, about girls and adolescents, is that, again, the most vulnerable got affected the most. And I think that we deeply care about inequality in the societies we live in the UK, in the US, you in Italy, I in Greece, but you know, it's a much more general setting, and perhaps this epidemic will magnify, perhaps, and I think that's a real danger, pre-existing inequalities like the one of discrimination in African societies or in townships and slums or in other places.
I think both at the country, within a country, but also across the world, we're seeing that the epidemic, the pandemic, the COVID pandemic is having devastating effect into every economy. But when you start out barely subsistence, a recession is going to be really painful. And, you know, we're talking about famines, which is something that really didn't happen for many, many years.
Yeah, I assure you, and also we know, and I know that you have been working this again, you work on so many things, on poverty traps. We also, there's like this general conjecture in development that perhaps losing a bit of your income when you are very poor may have massively non-linear effects vis-a-vis, let's say, if the two of us lose a bit of our income.
Of course, it can throw you into a poverty trap, because if there are non-linearities, so we know that you know, if it's very difficult to get out of poverty, once you're thrown back into the trap, it's going to be equally difficult to escape again.
Yeah, and if I was to summarize your work, is that we were taking for granted the improvements in poverty alleviation of the past 2 decades or so, perhaps a bit more, depending on where you start. And now this is a real danger that we will be going back and lose.
Absolutely. That should make us think of different ways of measuring poverty, because measuring poverty as a flow of consumption, it's really fragile. Yeah. I think, we should go back to the ideas of resilience and the capacity to withstand shocks. Because, if it's only being able to consume when the times are good, then maybe that's not really a reduction in poverty.
Indeed, you're absolutely right. Oriana, thank you very much for taking the time and being with us. I look forward to meeting you in person once social distancing gets removed. Thanks a lot for taking the time, and thanks a lot for enlightening us about what's happening in communities in low-income countries and frontier countries. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.